It is 5 minutes after, so thanks you all for joining. If anyone joins in, they'll join in. Um, Before we start, just want to ask you all how you're all doing today on this fine Wednesday towards the end of the year.
Sweet. I think we're expecting our first snowfall here soon tomorrow, so it's awesome seeing everything change.
Right on. Yep, we're all here surviving. We're all comrades here. We're all in that same headspace. So thank you all for joining. We're doing these for a couple weeks now, and I don't see any reason for stopping. And for today, we will be discussing what I wanted to talk about last week, which was the differences, or I guess the steps in you would take in our understanding our material conditions and the processes of appropriation versus appreciation. So, in appropriation, we all do it. We all appropriate, we all be, and we all exist. And the term appropriation used in this sense is just existences that are imposed by other existences to appropriate. And more so in the topics that we'll be discussing is to make one's own, like make another object in observation their own, to become, or in that process of becoming, which we discussed. So, in terms of appropriation versus appreciation, we can distinct two types of processes that come from capitalism and communism in our modes of production. So, under capitalism, under the privatized mode of production, it is the individual that appropriates first, like through colonization or through means of attaining through ownership, then to appreciate its being and its existence, to study its object as it is in its material conditions. We appropriate in capitalism first because we mean to capture markets before we assess or attain a profit. Then we appreciate those profits, or we appreciate afterwards the labor that which went into the processes of materializing a profit. So, in appropriation, the imposing of existences upon other existences, we understand that it to be a appropriative topic to discuss. It is that imposement of existences, that lack of appreciation first before imposing that existence, that appropriation. So we see this commonly, especially US imperialism has made this very apparent. Many examples that we can pull from. Appropriation looks like, and it is, when the Americans, when the US imperial troops, I guess the Europeans, the Eurocentrist people, way back in the 14, 1500s, came here to Turtle Island, this American land, and started to appropriate such conditions without first, of course, appreciating what is here first. So in their appropriation, they slaughtered and genocided the Native Americans here that were already, right? That appropriation led to the construction of the thereafter appreciation of their existences. This is why we have Thanksgiving, to shed a more positive light on the genocides and the terrors that were caused by the appropriative forces of the then European, now American presence. So the appropriation is something that we all do. We appropriate, impose our existence of beings onto other existences, right? But as I would say, Marxists, dialectics, communists, socialists, we appreciate first. And the term appreciation isn't some super positive notion. Appreciation, in this sense, is to understand through observation and study of the object at hand, the true purpose and essence of its qualities within our perception. So, appreciation is to better understand the objects in our immediacy, and not just physical objects, but objects, of course, like notions and ideas and concepts. So, appreciating communism is not to love and fawn and gawk at what it has to offer as the antithesis to capitalism. Rather, the appreciation of communism comes from the understanding of what makes communism, and capitalism, to understand what it is in relation to the material conditions at which it exists in, and in relation to the individual observer perceiving that phenomena, or in this case, capitalism, communism. So we do these processes and we flip them around in certain scenarios. But to make the great distinction, under capitalism, it is to appropriate first your material conditions, then to appreciate. There are some street names and city names, even some town names in America that are named after the tribes of the Native Americans. That is appropriation first because they colonized this land, then appreciation afterwards to show gratitude for the existences that were before the colonization or the appropriation happened. Under a more socialist or a dialectic understanding of the world, we appreciate first to better understand the object in hand before attempting to appropriate. So you would find this in a planned economy. We appreciate first, or we better understand our material conditions. Then we appropriate such conditions or impose our existences onto those conditions. And so the dichotomy of appropriation and appreciation always boils down to the fundamental qualities of the differences in the you and in the I's. So in the you, there is a fundamental quality or a value that differs the existences between the you and in the I. So in the I value, there is a fundamental difference in existence. I am I, and you are you. And so we can derive such explanations of appropriations and appreciations from this core principle of the you and I. And one of these is class antagonism. So class antagonism is just another flavor of the you and I, or the appropriation versus appreciation. So class antagonism, as we understand it now, under the current mode, capitalist mode of production, we understand that is the capitalist that appropriates such labor that appreciates the profits, of course. And in the socialist society, we appreciate the labor first, then appropriate the profits. So in that little relationship, we can better understand how a mode of production such as socialism can materialize, right? To break through the Red Scare propaganda that has been pushed by US imperial forces for so many decades now. Education is where we will get that understanding, and it is appreciation is how we do it. That understanding, that dialectic breakdown of how things are first before attempting to make one's own, to own it in a sense. So, on the topic of ownership, we can discuss the history of the class development or class antagonism, because humans are or just natural beings like animals and such are territorial naturally. We like to own things and have things, and the very first thing that we or as humans or as animals got to own was land, or any type of thing that a person or a human or anything that could be in their possession, land being one of them. So, land before women, women was the first persons to be appropriated in a hierarchy of classes. But it was land at first that was shared by a coalition of individuals or in a family, sometimes to the extent of a community, a coalition of families that has shared this land to reap the benefits in this shared economy, in this gift economy, in what Karl Marx had articulated to be a sort of primitive communism. So, in this primitive communism, we of course appreciated first, then appropriated, as it was our ancestors understood that the material conditions, they couldn't articulate in this way, but primordially and naturally through observation our ancestors understood that it is the material conditions to be appreciated first, to understand its being in relation to us and how it functions in our observations and in the material world. Then it is to be appropriated as such, how man, capital M, being that thinks, should be, how it ought to be. And so we combine the ideas of man, capital M, the being that thinks, with the ideas of appropriation and appreciation to get the very first class that was oppressed by man, or the superior oppressor, or so quote unquote superior oppressing class, which was and which are still women. Women were and are the first oppressed class to ever exist after having humans becoming an agrarian society, or like to develop agriculture and go stay away from nomadic types of living, schemes of living. So women were the first classes, and from women you get slaves, prisoners of war, or you get other existences outside of the coalition of the family, coalition of the community, which also is the you and I dichotomy, right? Those differences in values. Those differences in values help, quote unquote, the individual to make those tough decisions of whether to appropriate first or appreciate first. Because in a familial coalition, the coalition of individuals, we appreciate one another first. We understand one another, each other first as comrades. Then we appropriate, in a sense, and use our skills and labor to materialize such a revolution that which we are trying to do now. So in our spaces, of course, we appreciate each other first, then, in a sense, appropriate one another, or to impose existences such as ask questions, asking help from our fellow comrades, and understanding each other, spreading theory, spreading knowledge, that relationship. Women, of course, back then did not have the luxury of having their understood historical conditions, as people they were, or they are. So, in these throne conditions, as the very first oppressed class, women didn't know what was going on. They didn't know the any oppression was going on, nor did any other person knew what oppression was, as stuff was or just are. So, as people just do, as the developing class antagonism from agrarian societies, and then we move on to feudal or slave societies, then feudal nation states and whatever, that development can be traced back to the you and I dichotomy, or in this appropriation first, then appreciation afterwards, because it was men, lowercase m, of the penis holder, the appropriation of his material conditions, the appropriation of whoever can get his means of living or his means of satisfaction within his immediacy. Then it is thereafter that appreciation comes to materialize, whether it be in the form of appreciating the women or whether it be in the form of appreciating what man has. So, regardless of where the appreciation occurs or where it happens to lay upon, there exists some sort of appreciation. So, the white man, or man, capital M, can double down on this appropriation and appreciation process through this class antagonism, where you have one oppressed class doing all of the work, or you have all of the laboring class that materializes the value for the appropriating classes or the oppressing classes' consumption. So in appropriation, you impose an existence onto another. So whether in this case it'd be the man over the woman, or in our modern understanding, it'd be the boss over the worker, the employee, the capitalist over the proletariat. So then we understand appropriation, this opposement of existences, to proceed in our scheme and our structures in society, then to appreciate such. So when we do a lot of hard work in this society, when we slave and sweat and labor, and when we have our processes and systems in place in our bourgeois society, we are appropriated first before we are to appreciate any sort of that labor, and in this case in the form of a paycheck. So our labor is first appropriated to create the value, the surplus value for these capitalists, for these bourgeois beings. Then we are appreciated in the form of a paycheck, regardless the size of that appreciation. I would more call it pity than appreciation, but the same scope still follows. Appreciation is simply just a better understanding of the material conditions. The bourgeois understands that the proletariat or the worker needs to live to be able to reproduce themselves at work. And so, in order to reproduce themselves at work, there must be an incentive to work. And as most capitalists and most of the liberal bourgeois individuals believe, that it is the self interest, the greed, that reproduces the individual at work. People want money. And that is the end all be all to the reasoning of why people are and exist in the capitalist system. People want stuff, or basically, people want things. And so it is this self interest that creates this interesting class antagonism that we see in this society, at least from the point of view of the bourgeois lens. So, in our appropriation and appreciation, our class developments from where the women were the first oppressed class from slaves and such, we can better understand how our oppressed conditions materialize from the history and understanding the history of class antagonism, right? So, where even though it was thousands of years ago where women were being oppressed, women still are being oppressed. And it would be hundreds and still thousands of years where races, and not just races, but specific characteristics. And right now, I'm actually reading a book about how Nazis appropriated such philosophies to create their fascist regimes in the 30s. And so appropriation and appreciation goes well into that topic as well. Of course, the Nazis appropriated such being philosophy, so philosophies, and trying to understand like how to come up with a fundamental truth and how to appropriate such fundamental truth in order to make justification of the actions that they did. So I'm gonna go a little bit into that book there. So it's called Heidegger's Crisis by Slugga. Heidegger's crisis basically just talks about how from around the 1920s to 30s, all the way up to the end of the World War II, how Nazis appropriated and used such philosophies from all sorts of Western backgrounds to justify the actions of a nation state that is the divine right and ruler of the entire world. So it's based very heavily based in Eurocentrism, as any centricism is based in. It is entirely nationalistic, which exists completely antithetical to an international movement, such like as ours, the General Strike U.S., and of course other movements as well, and other organizations, Black Panther Party. It exists antithetical because international, of course, is looking beyond the nation's borders. So, of course, Nazis wanted to include only themselves, especially if it was just the race, and you had to be of German descent. And there were many examples of why the Nazis, fully believed it, as they had some ancient language, German, a similar akin to the ancient Greek language that was still around, versus French, which has evolved, which versus English, which has evolved, versus Spanish, which has evolved over the time. But German and Greek, supposedly were these ancient languages that remain true to their roots, and it is this traditionalism, this hyper conservatism, that bled way through the Nazi regime, and where it had to be this way because it has always been this way. And as we know, very dangerous ideology to think like that, where things have to be a certain way because it ought to be because it has been. So that was kind of the Nazi reasoning of why they did their stuff, how they like in some ways they appropriated philosophies in such way, versus and then they appreciate it, of course, through their regime, and whatever you want to call that appreciation. But of course they appropriated the philosophies in such ways to justify their actions, which then led to their appreciation of such. It draws a lot of parallels when you read that book, and then you look at modern 2024 America here, and how most of the values are kind of one to one, how most ideologies are being appropriated, how most ideas themselves are being misunderstood in the context at which they are presented in, to create this false reality, or to create a reality at which the material conditions do not explain as such, right, upon observation and articulation. So you'll get these individuals that believe one thing, of course, because of that's what has been presented to them in their observation, and then they, of course, go out and spew and spread misinformation based off their findings or their observations. So that little book is very interesting. But of course, we always go back to the appropriation, appreciation, the topic of this little discussion, how things are appropriated, that imposement of existences, and then how things are appreciated, or the understanding of those existences and those objects. So, as a little example to bring it back to a neutral space, the appropriation and appreciation process can be understood by wielding a hammer. So, or any tool, whether it be a flashlight or a screwdriver, but for good topics, we're always considered in the perspective of a hammer. So when we are presented with the hammer just on a table, it is first appreciated before any appropriation goes on, because the appreciation comes from the observation of that hammer, how it exists within our perception. We then begin to question and study its existence in relation to our perspective, which is then where the appropriation begins, because appreciation is just the object in study, the object that just exists, to be studied, to be understood. Appropriation is when you start to use that hammer for its intended or its non intended purposes, basically exerting your own existence onto that hammer to better understand its purpose in relation to your being. So, of course, we wield the hammer in hand, it is being appropriated by our existence. And so we start to play with it, better understand it. In the same ways we do with the hammer, we do with every single object, ideology, concept, idea, or whatnot and what give within our material perception. So it doesn't have to be a hammer. It could be the ideas of communism, socialism, and capitalism, and imperialism and fascism. And it could be neutral ideas such as like skyscrapers, buildings, boats, alligators, any sort of concept in which you can think of. This process occurs with the object in hand in study, and with the object in hand as an action, or as an appropriation. And so, with this, we understand how class antagonisms materialize with the object of class antagonism in hand. It is better understood as a historical analysis. So, which is why we went all the way back thousands of years ago to say that it was women who were the first peoples that were appropriated by such a man class or an appropriating class to help us understand how we get to now, where we have the boss and the worker. So over time, we have shed through the material observations of physical existences, like penis holder or non penis holder, vagina holders, or of a skin color or a race, or of a particular existence and being born in a particular part of the world. There's always these such particulars to separate the existences when the processes and the mode of production follows. Appropriation first, then appreciation. Because we do the same thing, of course, appropriate and appreciate. But as socialists and as communists and as Marxists, or as basically anyone who is antithetical to capitalism understands that we appreciate first, understand first, then appropriate or to impose our existences upon. So we're gonna come back to the idea. I'm gonna take a little bit of a water break. So if you guys have any questions, want to say anything, I'll take just a minute and then we'll get back into it. Women, the first people. Uh, all right, I'm back. I see Vin typing those, so we can wait for Vin, and then we can move on. No, that's a perfect explanation. I don't really get into reductionism. I still have to do a little bit of research or exposure to that idea myself. But no, that's a pretty good summary. The appreciation is the understanding of an entity, of an object, and the appropriation is how you use that. It's where it's being wielded. So in white man ideology, there is a lot of appropriation, is where you utilize an object before understanding what it is, right? That is where we get that classic appropriation, that being before becoming, which we'll be discussing soon as well. So to segue into that being and becoming, for real, every damn time, there's always appropriation first, then appreciation. That's where we get our holidays, our Christmases, our Thanksgivings. It's where we get our that's where we get our July 4ths. That is that appropriation versus appreciation, or then appreciation. So I want to take a step back. We talked about this a while ago, but it's always nice to have this idea in mind, especially when we're in our revolutionary spaces. We're going to be talking about alienation. I'm going to tie everything back in at the end, hopefully. So the ideas of alienation is to strip away oneself from the processes of production that materialize a value. So when I always use the example of chair making. So when an individual makes a chair, and they make chairs all day for a company, right, for a business, like they have the wood, provided by the company, they have the tools provided by the company. All they have to do is bring their labor, which is how you set up most examples of marketplaces and productions and businesses. Usually, it is the worker that reproduces themselves in such capacities to perform a labor, and it is this labor that materializes a value, right? Wood is just wood, is just wood. Chairs are just chairs, are just chairs. Until you understand how that wood became into a chair for the utility of sitting, or for the social signaling of having a really nice chair in the house, right? Depending on what kind of object was created, what kind of chair it was. But you still have the making of from wood material to the chair material. There was some sort of rearrangement of material conditions that occurred to materialize a chair within perception, that observation. And that is where value is created. Value, it doesn't inherently have any value. Value just is, and the value comes from the labor inputted from that process. So in that chair making process, so when the individual makes a chair, right, value is created. Value is then appropriated by the capitalist in that mode of production and then sold. And then the capitalist appreciates, quote unquote, better understands how to reproduce that worker in the form of a paycheck, whether that paycheck be small or big. It's all within the capitalist's individual perception of how to make that worker reproduce themselves, among other ways as well. When you commodify everything, when everything becomes something you have to buy in order to attain, like food or water or rent, shelter, and such, It is very easy for the capitalists to force the individual, in this case the worker, to reproduce themselves at work, to keep conducting this production of labor and this value for the appropriation of the capitalist class, right? Because we all know that it is labor that drives and churns the world's markets. It is labor that provides the value for the products that we consume, not because of one simple ownership of that object or the ownership of that idea, right? Because the simple ownership of just having things does not produce any value. There is no production of value in simply owning stuff. And yet we still live in a society which appreciates the owners first, then appropriates the profits for their, for their interests. So in this process of alienation in the chair making, we understand that workers work, and having worked at a, as a package handler in many places where I worked, you don't get to go home with any of your labors, with any of your finished products. You essentially go home empty-handed. You still sweat, you still labored, you still took your breaks, you still, expended your energy, you still invested your time and your existence into such processes that materialize the labor, and you know that it materialized the labor. You were there making the chairs, and yet you still went home basically empty-handed. So what does this do to the individual? So the capitalist believes that just because the paycheck exists or some form of compensation exists, which means the individual of the worker must be grateful. The individual has found purpose to make money. That is the system at which we exist in. It is for the purposes of perpetuating the market and is the purposes of perpetuating the capitalist mode of production. That is that incentive, that profit motive incentive. Um, Obviously a lot of contradictions, very flawed. I don't get me started on the word voluntary. I have written notes upon notes, basically a whole dissertation, a lot of research on the concept and topic of voluntary in this reactionary society. So we live in this free world, and we talked about freedoms last week because I was so heated on a conversation with I had with my cousin 2 weeks ago at a family event, and freedoms came up. And I had to articulate freedoms are not just inherent. You don't just have freedoms, they come from somewhere. Like our freedoms of speech right now costed us hundreds of thousands of lives in Palestine, right? Our freedoms of a press and our freedoms of gathering, right, to bear arms, not to self-incriminate, to vote, all come at a cost. And those costs right now come at the cost of lives overseas. So freedom is a whole big topic. I mean, we can talk about freedoms of being voluntary all day, every day. Say nothing is voluntary. Exactly. That's what's going on. Everything is always forced upon us in this constant state of consumption, just simply being. You don't consume, like eat, or you don't have stuff. This natural consumption is you observing, your ears listening to my words, your eyes watching this screen, your being existing in the space is a natural consumption, which means it is a naturally forced condition. Like time forces the individual through the experience of life, 1 second at a time, one perceived second at a time. But back to alienation, that was a whole topic. Alienation is when you, the individual worker, go home empty-handed. So what does this do to the individual who goes empty-handed? They feel, well, empty. And it's not until the end of the week or the end of 2 weeks, and oh God forbid, the end of the month, like once a month, you get your paycheck. And that paycheck is a means of keeping and retaining your material conditions within perception. So your paycheck provides you your food because food has been commodified. Uh, your paycheck perpetuates that water that keeps you alive. It perpetuates the rent or the mortgage that you have to keep yourself housed. So, under this voluntary action society, you can choose whether or not, right? In theory, it's not how it actually works, but in theory, in this liberal society, you can choose whether or not you can have a job. You can choose whether or not you can get a degree, go to college, get it. You can choose to be homeless. You can choose to do a lot of things in this society. And then just this past week or this last week, I said in antithesis, or you could say, well, why not just be forced to have a house? Because in this voluntary society, you can choose to have a house. Wouldn't it be cooler to I don't know, be forced to have a house, be forced to have food, be forced to have all of these, these subsistent needs fulfilled already. I don't know, just a thought. And then I was talking to my some friends I haven't talked to in a while at their workplace, at their job, and we were talking, and I was saying, of course, proletariat, owning the means of production, rah rah. They're not super radicalized, but they hate capitalism. They just need a little push for it, help understanding why. So I was going up to them and I was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you just owned the place you worked at? Because most of the time you don't want to be at work. So you don't want to own production. And so owning production is one of those steps into, getting our dictatorship of the proletariat, or better understanding our material conditions and how our paychecks materialize. Where in the production, the process of production does our paycheck come from? So I was trying to explain those concepts to those friends, and how wouldn't it be cool to own the place where you work? Or wouldn't it be cool that every single transaction that you rung up for a customer, that money went into your bank account essentially? Right? All these little cool little ideas. But every time I talk to people IRL or online, I'm always in there to plant a seed, regardless if you plant a tree or you plant a, like, a fern or some sort of, at least plant a seed. Because the seed, once planted, will get watered by the experience of life. Once you have introduced a concept or an idea to an individual's perception, that seed will grow. In theory, you can have a good seed, or the stuff that you're saying, go into bad soil, someone who's not taking it, and it will not grow. You can have a bad seed, right? Whatever you said came out in a very certain particular way, but you have good soil, maybe something can happen. Bad seed, bad soil, nothing's happening. Good seed, good soil, it's a home run right there. But the whole point when I go into these conversations with these people, not just friends or strangers as well, is to plant a seed. Leave the conversation planting a seed. Even if you get the entire concept across and they're fully on board, make sure that seed is planted. Always leave room for growth for the individual to consider. So always give them ideas to think about, because the most you can do when going out, organizing, and talking to people is the actual talk, and that talk is your seed, and how you project yourself, how you articulate that explanation or whatever you're trying to say will help that seed be planted, right? But of course, it depends on the soil. So you can just start spraying and throwing seeds around everywhere, and hopefully one will grow. And that is kind of like the shotgun in the dark that we're doing when we're organizing, especially here in the US Imperial Core. If you're here in America, it's hard to get people to organize because US hegemony is really deeply rooted inside the schemes of life of individuals that live. There must be a job, you must go to school, there must be businesses, billionaires, right? Regardless of what the individual thinks of, they exist, so therefore they must exist. But that's on the processes of being and becoming, which is actually right now. So from alienation, we understand that you go home without any of your work. So, and especially if you take your work home that you don't want it to come, that's also a form of alienation. It's alienation of your livelihood. You're bringing home work to your home. You're alienating yourself from home, in home, because of your work. But the processes of being and becoming, similar to the processes of appropriation and appreciation, being first, right, the object in study, just is. There is no other reason beyond the object's existence besides being. It just is, right? My phone right here is sitting in front of me, just is. It's just here, right? Your screen, whether it be a phone or a monitor or a laptop, wherever you're listening to this on, just is. Your laptop is just here. And in the processes of becoming is when we start to introduce the material conditions from our observable environment into consideration. So even though my phone is just here, it got here somehow, right? So longer examples like your phone, your laptop, maybe your house or apartment, maybe some of your objects you've had for a while, right? It'll take longer to explain its existence within your perception, right? That history, because there's a lot of history involved with that object in relation to you and the material conditions in which it exists in. So in other examples, we could talk about notions and ideas. People are on different paths of understanding what capitalism is, right? And what socialism, communism is in our material conditions, that is where we get that appreciation of these objects before we appropriate. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm appropriating such ideas, meaning I'm imposing my existence through articulation to have this discussion with you all here. Thank you very much. So, besides the phone, besides the objects within our perception, being and becoming are two different processes, just like the you and I, appropriation, appreciation. Being is, and becoming considers that process of all of the material conditions consumed within the individual's immediacy. So becoming is that process, that historical process of that why stuff is, and then we understand it through that appreciation. We understand that becoming is that process where all of the historical actions make the summative finality, or make that summative truth that we observe in our perception. So when you go out, walking down the street, driving to your work, or behind a cash register, up on top of the building, you understand everything as thrown. We understand material conditions as just is. In our perception, that's what we are observing. In the processes of becoming, we understand how these objects, how these material conditions materialized within perception. So when you have your daily commute, or if you drive, or if you go out and see people, those particular existences, of course, didn't just pop in out of nowhere. They have some sort of historical context that which explains their presence in the immediate moment. When you see someone walking down the street, they did not just walk down the street just to appear in front of your eyes. They walked down the street because they wanted to, in a similar fashion, in the ways you are conducting yourself in your own life. So there's this one um, terminology that explains the understanding that individuals live just as vivid lives as you right now. So it's understanding that people live second by second, day by day, in these processes of appropriation and appreciation, this being and becoming, just as vividly as you are listening to with your ears from my voice. Other people are experiencing life as well. So I was talking to my little brother a couple weeks ago as well about this certain topic. So I asked him, how many people does he see in a day? I only see, like, maybe a few people. I don't get out that much. But when I do, sometimes I see dozens of people. Sometimes I go out, parks, malls, or whatever, just to walk around. I asked him, he goes to school. He sees a bunch of people every day. And I asked him, how well do you think you know people's schemes of life? Like, you live your own scheme, do you understand how other people live their schemes? And it is understanding how people live outside of their schemes, how people live outside of their beings, that helps you understand what makes a community. Because not everything can be done all at once, right? In the processes of being, you just are. In the process of becoming, you understand that it is the people around you that help you become who you are. So there is this one theory as well, great man theory, where it's like Alexander the Great. You have these people in history, Julius Caesar, these great men, quote unquote, in history that make up the fabric of our beings, of our human existences. Of course, this great theory I say was nonsense. Right? It doesn't take just one man to move a mountain. It takes an army. It takes a bunch of individuals who lived just as vivid lives as we do now, even if they lived hundreds of years ago, right? Every single one individual person contributed just as much as a Julius Caesar in terms of their labor, in terms of their being and existence. Attributing one achievement to one individual is to dismiss the millions, if not the billions, of individuals that preceded that event that helped materialize that event in the first place. So we must, of course, first appreciate our peoples of the forgotten names, the billions and trillions of people before us that helped materialize the conditions at which we exist in now. Because in the Green New Deal, when FDR signed it, he just didn't go down there, boots on the ground, establishing this New Deal. Everyone in America, or the millions of people, helped contribute to that change. When Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and the other guy, all three of them went up into and walked onto the moon, or around the moon. It just was not just them that had that monumentous achievement. It was a whole team right here on Earth, back on the ground, helping that achievement to occur. So we must understand that things exist with historical context. That historical context contains all these millions and billions of people that helped materialize, people just like us, living just as vivid lives, right? Struggling against our class oppression to help make history. We are all making history right now, even as insignificant as, some may put us out to be. I mean, we're all just a little bit insignificant, regardless of what we do. In the sands of time, everything gets washed away, right? We can tell you what happened exactly 1,000 years ago in a certain house to a certain person. That's lost in history, which is where you get great man theory. That great man that signifies that particular part of history. Karl Marx could be considered a great man in history of, him in the late 1800s. Julius Caesar, of course, we attribute to many. Alexander the Great, these great men in history that contributed to our historical context. George Washington, a great man in history, but of course, the American Revolution was fought over hundreds of thousands of lives, right? Which is we'll never talk about. We always bring up the figure of, oh, these hundreds of thousands of individuals in our history fought, but we can't name them. The only person we can name and attribute their existence, the only thing that makes their existence real, according to our history and understanding and our current, articulation, is great man theory. Is, oh, that's George Washington, that's Alexander Hamilton, all of these people within that signed the Declaration. White man history, I would like to say. So not great man, white man history. So in the processes of being and becoming, being is that great white man. Becoming is understanding that, well, that white man didn't do everything, right? I always say the Walmart CEO doesn't go out, go down and ring up every single customer, offload every single pallet, stock every single shelf into the Walmarts that materialize a profit for him. Because we of course live in a society which appreciates the owners of production and appropriates the profits at which are materialized from the mode of production. So while the Walmart CEO doesn't go down and ring up every customer at a cash register, whether Alexander the Great didn't slay every single man he slaughtered in his great wars and his conquests, uh, Einstein himself, very smart person, didn't come up with all of his theories by himself. There was a team, right, of physicists or just individuals in that history that helped contribute to the advancements in physics that we get, or there's just any advancements in society. It always comes from the multitude of individuals, not the single one great white man, but of course the conglomeration of individuals that help make that reality in history. As all of you here right now, right? Maybe you just been here, just got in, or you've been here for about that 45 minutes. You are making history by just being here. And in the processes of becoming, you better understand our material conditions from the discussion that we're having. Of course, then you can go ahead and do whatever you want with your lives afterwards. But it is beautiful that the process of being and becoming can articulate such existences, and where the forgotten people of time are appreciated, right, because of the contributions they made. So, moon landing, that was a thousands of people's of work, not just three. um, Revolutionizing in America, that was a whole capitalist cat class appropriating hundreds of thousands of people to make that happen. But we only acknowledge the great man, right? The white man that made the history, which is how we learn history. And so, in that learning of how history becomes, we have to understand where that history comes from. So, white man history comes from, of course, the white man, and so we understand history through a white lens. So it is not until we better understand history through a different lens, or we understand history through a different medium, and where we will appreciate other types or other perspectives of history. Because most of history now, especially here in America, is told through the white appropriative perspective, that utilization of history as it is thrown in, and where Thanksgiving is about food and not the slaughtering and genocide of the Native Americans, and how we have Christian and religious holidays observed in our federal governments. So there goes that separation of state and church. So, in our last topic, we're coming up on 10 minutes before, we're going to be finishing off by talking about that good old seizing the means of production. That good old phrase, that phrase that all of us commies love to talk about, seizing the means of production. So, what does it mean to seize the means to produce such things? In production, we produce. We are producing things. So, I made a couple of these zines I produce such artwork and stuff, and I materialize such scenes. I produce, and I had the means of producing. Well, I had access to the means of producing. I myself don't have a printer, and I don't have much of that artistic artwork. But I have the means of attaining such avenues to produce such scenes. So that, in a sense, I have owned the means of producing such zines. And as far as a mechanic, I have the means of producing such repair since I own tools, which is a means of producing a repair. So, seizing the means of production means seizing the means to produce such desired values or conditions for our existences. So, seizing the means of production as a general term is just the entirety of the producing agent in production. So, we commonly refer to these items as factories, tools. You can think of these drills, hammers, um, giant structures, right? Not physical structures, but the means of production is also a hierarchical or a sociocratic structure of organizing in which people can do stuff in an organized manner, right? Whether it be top down or horizontal organizing. But seizing the means of producing and seizing the means of production is a fundamental step towards establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. So seizing the means of production is just you going after and owning, right? You own or you have within your possession a drill to, to produce the means of drilling. You have a drill and you have your nails and your drills and your wood and such, and all of a sudden you have the means to produce house. The only thing that the individual is missing is that expertise, that trained professionalism in which it, costs the individual their existence to produce such a house. So an individual Joe Schmo, certainly not myself, I can fix a car, but I can't build a house, which is where the individual labor, our skills as a proletariat and as a laboring class come into play very effectively because members of the bourgeois themselves only know how to appropriate and appreciate second. They don't know a thing or two about fixing a car. They don't know a thing or two about building a house. They don't know a thing or two about purifying water other than owning the means of producing such conditions. Bourgeois individuals understand very well how to own things because it is the white man's ideology to understand how to appropriate things within their material conditions. And this appropriation first, then appreciation, of course, is very symbolic of the capitalist mode of being that we exist in. So when the white capital M man that being that thinks, appropriates his material conditions, he leaves very little to appreciate afterwards, as what has become appropriated within his, appropriation with whatever his being constitutes, he then reproduces those values inside of that appropriated being or object. So Thanksgiving is no, of course, well, never has been, well, no longer is about the Native Americans and the genocide and the entire slaughtering of basically an entire race. Now, just food and having a family together, nice and happy. That appropriation first, then appreciation. To appreciate what has been appropriated. Very weird behavior, if you ask me. Colonizing is such a very strange behavior that we observe in our society. Imperialism as well. Capitalism outward, very strange. The decay of capitalism, fascism, very strange. But it's not so strange when you understand that it is within the schemes of these individual lives that would say otherwise. I mean, you if you only knew right of U.S. hegemony, and if you only knew of how to be taught this type of way of thinking, then you would only know how to be and how to act in certain such ways. If your entire life you've only ever been told, hey, communism bad, and then your job sustains your material conditions, right? Your billionaires and your politicians aren't causing you too much rough. They're just being a little bit nuisance. Then, of course, the individual would not think otherwise. Oh, communism is bad. My job helps me. The capitalist mode of production, right, perceivably through what the individual experiences, helps the individual, the workers, because it abolishes poverty by having such means of mediation in production. Without our education, the individual falls within this scheme of, I would say, of lying or the scheme of untruths, and where the individual is perceiving their material conditions through the narrative or through the propaganda, right, enforced by the US imperial force or just the general imperial capitalist force, the owners of production, that preferred narrative or propaganda spewed. because the system needs workers to reproduce themselves, and workers aren't forever. Seizing the means of production means seizing the means of owning that production. So, not just merely having the factories, but understanding how to have the factories, how to conduct, how to manage, how to have the capital in order to materialize a desired profit for the collective good. Right now, there's materialized profits for the individual selective private interest, but of course, as we are seizing the means of production as a proletariat and as a revolutionizing class, we want to seize the means for a collective benefit. For about 5 minutes before, if any of you have any questions now, I'll end off trying to summarize everything. But I'm going to take a little bit of a drink. If you have any questions, type it out. Speak now, forever hold your peace. No. Cool. Looks like we're all on the same page here. Hopefully, I'm not putting you any to sleep right now. So we're going to go back to the very beginning for those joining us a little bit later. We're doing a summary right now. So remember the very beginning we talked about appropriation or colonization versus appreciation and basically communization, like community, right? And how in the process of appropriating that imposement of existence before understanding leads to such phenomena such as imperialism or fascism. Talked about how the Nazis appropriated such philosophies, then of course afterwards appreciated such philosophies from their appropriation. It's where you get your Nietzsche's, your Fichte's, your Heidegger's, your philosophers of those times of the 1930s, helping push the propaganda, the narrative of National Socialism. Good, because philosophy, good. But then you get into that entire rabbit hole of why Nazis are bad. Then, of course, we talked just a little bit, wanted to get a little bit more into about class development and how women were the first oppressed classes. And then from women, we get slave society, then the feudal era, kings and queens, then you get into wage labor, and how the differences between man, women, slave owner, slave, king, serf, or oligarchy and serf, and then now we have our boss and worker. So from the man and the women, lowercase m, the penis holder, then the women, the vagina holder, up all the way to thousands of years later into what we have it now. Then the boss, the capital owner, and then the worker, the laboring individual, the individual that sells their labor in the market. He then, of course, touched a little bit about alienation and how the individual worker goes home without any of their work, right? So when a chair maker makes a chair for the capitalist profit, the chair maker doesn't go home with their chairs that they have made. They essentially go home empty-handed, nothing to show for their labor, and that nothing to show really messes with the individual. Sure, I labored in sweat and I feel tired, but I have nothing to show for it. It does some pretty much some psychological damage to the individual, but it is so normalized within our US hegemony that the individual thinks nothing of it. Oh, I'm supposed to be going home with nothing because I get a paycheck at the end of the week. That is that substitution of having your materialized values from your labor, that compensation through the paycheck. And then, of course, through being and becoming, where that paycheck helps you become because you be as a worker. When you be, you just are. When you become, you understand that your material conditions and your perception of the conditions make you who you are. So you are, but it is your material conditions which are just constantly always being imposed upon you, as Vin has said so eloquently, that we are and just exist in our material conditions. So we are our material conditions, that process of becoming. And of course, just a few minutes ago, we were discussing the topics of seizing the means of production, which itself is a form of appropriation of conditions, right? So we, as the proletariat, a revolutionizing class, appreciate the means of production first, meaning we understand what the means of production harbor and hold, not just some object that a child or an infant just waddles and flails around. We understand that we must appreciate the means of production first before seizing or appropriating such production means and conditions. So we're about that hour mark, about that 5 o'clock. I don't want to hold any of you for too long. So it's basically it for this week. Um, Don't really have a topic for next week. Usually I do, but of course we'll always have something to talk about. The world's always going around, and the world is always, giving us reasons why to talk about, it, especially through our analysis of class antagonism. It's everywhere, especially when you have a capitalist owning class. It's everywhere. You have so many things to talk about anything. It's ridiculous. So that pretty much leaves us there. Thank you all for joining. Some people coming in and out, fine. No, thank you. And so I'll be hanging out for like a couple 10 more minutes, but I will be just silent. So if any of you do have questions or just thought of questions, I'll still be here. But if you need to go, go please. And again, thank you very much for being here. I'll be here for a little bit. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Hey, Jaden,
What's going on, Day?
are you um, are you connected to any of the individuals who set up the Bay Area or like any of the Cali pages for Instagram?
I think Jaffa runs the Bay Area one. Yeah, I know. I know that guy. I don't know about any of the people who are not connected with any of the SoCal chapters.
All right. 'Cause I was gonna try to get them that you all storefront and stuff, just so they know about it. For the zines. I'm
Oh yeah.
almost done with ours. I'm still working on it.
Oh, nice, good progress. I was like gonna reach out to them. I was thinking about doing one in-person event. I just wanted to know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to get together with the Bay Area people as a formal first general strike meetup.
Sweet.
Oh yeah, I was thinking about time banking. Do you know any more details about time banking? How one can get in it, how it works? Because I'm interested in um, joining a time banking because we have one here in the Bay Area.
Hmm. Oh, sweet. If you all already have one, basically it's just like just trading hours for hours. And you necessarily don't have to give back to whoever, provided you a service or training or anything, or you can save your hour for someone else, another time bank member, so that's good as well. But like for you, you have a great skill at, working on cars. So like say like if someone needed, a service like an oil change or something, whatever time that you spent doing that, you will actually get that back in credits. Um, I don't know if like each time bank does like different credits. Like if you do an hour, that's like one credit or whatnot. That's how the one here works. But I just try to check out and ask them about that. But regardless, you can get a lot of services done free of charge, and it's good community building too because they have like ours does like extra activities like picnics at the park and all types of events and whatnot.
Right on. I was thinking about doing something with zines and time banking. I just want a little more information. I'm gonna get into the time bank that we have here because I just found out about it, and I'm gonna do something with
Mhm.
zines as well. Because zines is a great way to spread information, but I think time banking is a great transition off of dollars, actual like current fiat currency.
I did a couple graphics specifically for like time banking. We can throw in a zine, possibly get someone else to do like a little bit detail, probably like some points or whatnot, some facts, possibly like resources, ones that we know of, like the one near you is one here in Michigan. It's a documentary about time banking. I can send you some information so we can put one together.
Yeah, 'cause I think a time bank zine would be great because it falls in what we're trying to do. Like, and so we have the memes on zines, just our and then our regular join the general strike and then what Z made. I think those are great.
Right on.
Do we have any of this stuff published or like preliminary, like first drafts and stuff? The zine?
I have a few drafts. I can turn my webcam on. I have a few of them right here.
Sure. Yeah, let's see. I I currently don't have a computer. I had to sell it to make rent. Or else I would offer to do graphics. I can contribute like formatting, writing, and editing to anyone who just wants a second set of eyes to like correct grammar or spelling or anything like that. I went to college at